This article is The Perception of Bilateral Chimeric Figures Following Hemispheric Deconnexion by Levy, Trevarfen, and Sperry. Patients who have undergone surgical section of the forebrain commissures for epilepsy that is hard to control retain mental function in each disconnected hemisphere, and this is used as an advantage to study cerebral dominance and lateral specialization. Lateralization of speech and calculation to the disconnected left hemisphere and visual spatial recognition in the disconnected right hemisphere is usually found. The two disconnected hemispheres working on the same task may process the same sensory information in two different ways. The prediction is that the bilateral language competency should produce a correlated perceptual performance deficit. The testing technique, which uses the tendency of each hemisphere to affect perceptual completion of patterns beyond the vertical midline, is used. Specific functional superiority of the right hemisphere for tasks that involve recognition and comparison of visual form. It demonstrates the capacity of the disconnected minor hemisphere to dominate motor performance on certain mental activities. The subjects in this experiment are the four patients of Dr. P.J. Vogel and Dr. J.E. Bogan, and the tests were conducted from April to August of 1970. The four patients were NJ, LB, AA, and CC. Their ages and their post-surgery scores on the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale are provided here, and after surgery, seizures have been well controlled. The apparatus in this for stimulus presentation was a modified Harvard 2-channel stethoscope Durband's model number 2TB1. An example of this apparatus is shown on the left side of the visual. Each stimulus was presented for 150 milliseconds on a small white card centered on the fixation point, in this case, which was a bright red spot of light. And eye movements were recorded by two non-polarizing electrodes, and tests were monocular using the patient's dominant eye. On the right side of the visual is an example of an eye readout. Procedure. Chimeric stimuli were presented in the patient's visual field with the aim of inducing separate and rival perceptual processes in the right and left hemispheres. The design depended on the hallucinated completions theory, and that is when a stimulus extends past the midline of the visual field, one will see a whole and complete stimulus. The subject looked into the stethoscope and was told he would see a picture flash briefly, and was then told to point to the picture from among an array of 3 to 8 similar pictures. There were 4 different tests in this experiment, and each one was conducted on a different day. For each test, there were 3 modes of response required. 1, to point to the picture with the right hand, 2, to point to the picture with the left hand, and in the third, the choice stimuli was removed, and they were asked to verbally name what they had seen. The first observation was with facial recognition. It was anticipated that the disconnected minor right hemisphere to be superior to the major in performing facial recognition. This was confirmed by the results. All the subjects showed a preference for the face presented on the left of the chimeric figure with a low error rate of only 3%. This graph is a summary of the results. As you can see, the left bar, which represents the left side, is the highest, the middle bar is the right side, and the right is the error, which was low in this case. And this is shown for all 4 experiments. And for the first one, facial recognition, this is what the patients were shown. They were taught that face 1 was Bob, face 2 was Paul, and face 3 was Dick, and subjects had difficulty learning these name associations. They switched to a response by verbal naming instead of manual matching, and the score is reversed in favor of the right half of the stimulus. The left hemisphere found this type of test extremely difficult and was inclined to describe the features of the right field face instead of naming it as a unit. To check that the recognition of unfamiliar faces as a whole is difficult for the left hemisphere, another series of trials were run with the same procedure, except the whole faces were exposed in the right field and identified by pointing with the right hand. And after questioning the patients, they failed to recognize that the faces were the combination of 2 different faces. Tests for bilateral images. The previous trials of facial recognition can be interpreted that the chimeric stimulus led to the formation of 2 separate perceptual images, 1 in each hemisphere, and only gain obvious expression depending on the task. An additional set of trials was run to test for the presence of the subordinate precept by blocking the routine response and requesting a different kind of response to favor the other hemisphere. This is known as interrupted trials. For example, they were asked to describe the stimulus, but before they were describing it, they were interrupted and then told to point to the correct face instead. Consistent with earlier results, the manual responses were directed to a match for the left half of the stimulus, and the verbal responses described the right half. The second observation is the apprehension of nameless forms. This set of tests was done to see if the minor hemisphere's ability to recognize faces is a specific or more general ability to apprehend complex spatial forms. The aim of the design was to create stimuli that had properties such as faces, such as bisymmetry and complex organization, but were not at all face-like. So in this example, they used the antlers of the moose, elk, and deer. Once again, they showed favor of the left field for manual pointing by either hand and the reverse preference for verbal readout. The third observation was the recognition of highly familiar objects. In this case, they used the rows I and B. They were interested to know whether minor hemisphere superiority would remain for the recognition of common objects with well-established verbal labels. The results followed with the findings obtained for faces and unfamiliar forms. There was strong left field preference in trials that involved the manual pointing and a reversal when they were required to verbally name the objects seen. The last observation done was with chain patterns. Chain patterns are used because these patterns lend themselves to a sequential analysis that is expected to favor the major hemisphere. In this test, both hemispheres saw the identical elements, but permuted in different ways on the two different sides. There was strong right-hand preference with direct matching by manual signal. In this example, there was a higher error rate because there are 8 alternatives instead of 3, so the following equation was used to compare the proportion of correct responses due to non-chance, and that equation is PA equals PK plus 1 minus PK times PG. Discussion. When right-left pattern chimeras joined at midline are viewed uncentered by patients that underwent foregrain commissurotomy, they remain unaware of the discrepancy even when there is gross mismatch. This general result occurred with all categories of the stimuli: the facial recognition, unfamiliar objects, familiar objects, and chain patterns. The two hemispheres can process conflicting information simultaneously and independently. The input and perceptual task remain unchanged, and the task can be performed by either the right or left hemisphere, but they are accomplished with two different strategies. The right minor hemisphere dominates when no language is involved and only direct manual pointing was required. Results support the view that lateral specialization may be understood as a means for providing for language and related symbolic functions in one hemisphere without hindering the development of spatial perceptual abilities in the other. It is clear that the dominance of motor expression switched sharply from the right to left hemisphere when the instructions required a verbal instead of manual pointing response. All 4 tests confirm the presence of a fundamental difference in the way the right and left hemisphere perceives things. While the results of the facial and antler tests show a minor hemisphere superiority, the data doesn't exclude the possibility that face recognition is a special ability beyond that for a general form apprehension.